Call to order the Public Services Committee, Tuesday, May 8th, 2012 at 5 o'clock. First item on the agenda would be review and approval of the minutes dated April 9th, 2012.
So moved, Brown.
Second, Erpenbach.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
And that passes 4-0. All right, the first item on our agenda today will be the distracted driving proposal, and Mr. Rich Lawler will speak for the group. Rich, one moment, please. Any guests that haven't signed in, we do have a sign in at the front desk. We would like you to sign in, please. Thank you.
Chairman Anderson, thank you. I'm Rich Lauer, and I live at 2017 South Austin Drive in Sioux Falls. I'm here representing as a coordinator of a group called Citizens Advocating Cell Phone Safety While Driving. We have just a few members of our committee here, and of the organizations that are listed on the handout. I'd like to just introduce them and their organization. Julie Ward, Vera McKinnon, Marilyn Buskell, AAA of South Dakota, Megan Myers, the South Dakota State Medical Association, Jesse Smith, Sanford Health, Bruce Heide, or Vern Heide Motor Cars, excuse me, Bruce, or excuse me, Vern. Drew Duncan, I'm sorry, Drew Duncan with the South Dakota Insurance Alliance, represents Verizon Wireless and Allstate Insurance, and Susan Randall with the South Dakota Voices for Children, and Greg Boris with South Dakota Voices for Children, and Dave Renelli, Sioux Empire Safety Village. You'd asked me a moment ago, Chairman Anderson, if I had an overhead, and I had meant to bring one, and it's page 33 of the South Dakota Driver's Manual, but I can just tell you about it. My grandson is the oldest one that lives in this community, is 15. The rule in their family is you drive at 16, so he's getting ready. And he had the manual, and it was on their dining room table a couple of months ago when I sort of got interested in this project. And on page 33, the state of South Dakota states clearly in the King's English that when driving, have two hands on the wheel, 10 and 2. And I thought that was instructive, and also one needs to reflect on it, because while that is our stated position in the state of South Dakota, we have, at least to this point, been unable to affect any regulation that would enforce that position. One of our group members, Myron Rao, who is president of the South Dakota Auto Dealers and the South Dakota Truckers, wanted to be here, but he's in Washington, D.C. today, but he asked me to submit a statement from him for the record. And so I have this statement, and should I just set it here? Or I can bring it around. That's just a brief background on the evolution of this effort in Sioux Falls. It was about 95 years ago that acting as a responsible society in response to the hazards of alcohol use when behind the wheel, that our society, at least in this area, began to regulate drinking and driving. In the past several years, technology has brought a new set of hazards that frankly are far more dangerous than drinking and driving, and it's called distracted driving. And the most egregious of the distracted driving issues, and there are many of them, from makeup to eating hamburgers to tuning the radio to looking out the window, whatever. The most egregious is the one that causes you, in effect, to have your eyes closed while you're driving, and that is texting while driving. That's both sending and receiving text messages. The crash risk while text messaging is 23 times greater than when not texting. Cell phone use alone when driving delays the driver's reaction time as much as having a blood alcohol concentration at the legal limit of 0.08%. And the use of handheld electronic devices increases the risk to the person using that by a multiple of 4. Now, the average text message takes 4.6 seconds. So if you'll humor me, I'm going to ask the committee and the rest in the room, when I start counting, I want you to close your eyes, please. And when I get to 1,005, you can open your eyes. 1,001, 1,002, 1,003, 1,004, 1,005. That's the same amount of time that driving slightly under the 30-mile-an-hour speed limit it takes to drive from this building to City Hall, a block down the street. Now, there isn't a person in this room that would consider getting in their vehicle, driving 27.5 miles an hour on a city block with your eyes closed. None of us would do that, except when you're texting, and that's exactly what happens. The evidence is overwhelming that texting while driving and the use of handheld electronic devices is dangerous. It's dangerous to the user and dangerous to everyone using our city streets and sidewalks. I frankly doubt there's a person in the room who, during the past week, has not seen someone texting while driving in our city. Our group is proposing that the City Council adopt the following ordinance. The ordinance would have 2 parts. The first is a ban on texting while driving on the streets of the city of Sioux Falls, no exceptions. Secondly, a ban on the use of any handheld electronic device. And parenthetically, I would say that that would be cell phones and GPS handheld deals, Blackberries, I think my grandson calls it an iPod. In any event, a ban on the use of any handheld electronic device while driving in a school zone when children are present. The exceptions would be law enforcement, fire rescue, and emergency medical technicians if they're on official business. Now, this is consistent with the special environment that we create around our schools, both public and private, where the speed limit when kids are present drops from 30 to 15 miles an hour. Why a local ordinance? Well, notwithstanding the fact that there's virtually unanimous support for a ban on texting, in this area it's 90%, South Dakota has failed to pass a ban on texting. I wouldn't begin to guess why that's possible, but in my 73rd year, I've decided not to waste any more of the available time trying to figure out why that takes place. But what is interesting is that among the 37 states that as of today have banned texting while driving, all of our neighbors from the same cultural background, North Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, Wyoming, have all banned texting while driving on their streets. Somehow they have figured out how to do this. Sioux Falls has both the ability under home rule and an obligation to regulate and thereby reduce this threat to public safety. In terms of this effort, we should not think that we are in the first train west on the Oregon Trail, the first wagon, and we're certainly not on the Starship Enterprise. Given that 3/4 of the states and dozens of cities have passed laws to reduce this hazard, it frankly should not be a problem for Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I asked Senator Craig Teason, who's the representative from Pennington County, or senator from Pennington County, and he's been the prime sponsor of legislation in the state legislature to ban texting while driving. I asked him about the notion that it's difficult to enforce, and he had 2 comments which he said I might share with you. His first comment was, he said, our cops are every bit as good as the cops in the 37 states and dozens of cities that have these laws in place. And secondly, if you and I as ordinary citizens see this potential violation, the cops can see it. It's interesting that Senator Teason is retired as the chief of police in Rapid City. In the handout, which Captain Myron Rao asked me to submit for the record, he's retired, a retired captain from the Highway Patrol. He states in his comments, other states and municipalities have seemed to find a way to enforce their statutes and ordinances. I am sure those jurisdictions are willing to share their experience and provide guidance. During my law enforcement career, there were several laws enacted that were difficult to enforce, but in the interest of highway safety, we were always able to find a way. I don't suggest that enforcing a ban on texting is easy. It may be more difficult than sitting in a black and white pointing a radar gun at the oncoming traffic, and it's clearly a lot easier than what the two officers had to do at 2 in the morning when I met them at our office because our alarm system had gone off. I opened the door and stepped aside, and they walked into a dark building. That's not easy. The reason we're meeting today and requesting this ordinance reflects the fundamental truth about governance. At the core of every law or ordinance is society's objective to make a clear statement regarding acceptable behavior. Once that is done, we will then reap the benefits of what Chief Doug Barthels described to me as voluntary compliance, which is to say that the vast majority of our fellow citizens will stop doing what the law now prohibits. This does not happen until you have the law in place. Then about 80% of us obey the law, which is a good statement on the folks in the Midwest. And we obey it whether or not there's a patrolman in a black and white at the end of the block. In this case, that is a huge improvement in reducing the risk currently loose on our streets. If it turned out that we never wrote a single citation, and I'm not suggesting that we would pass something and say we're not going to enforce it, but voluntary compliance alone makes this a highly rewarding undertaking. And those rewards are measured in lives saved and life-altering injuries prevented. The responsibility you are undertaking today is not about snow gates or commercial activity location, potholes, or naming rights. Historically, we had about 65% of our electorate support the expenditure of $100 million plus on an events center. And I frankly think that's a good project. What you are being asked to do today is supported by 90% of the electorate. It has a direct effect on the well-being of each of us. There is no downside to the city in this proposal. It is all upside, improving public safety on our streets and sidewalks. When you put your head on your pillow tonight, I hope you are committed to the notion that no child, no young mother or father, none of the loved ones of any member of our community deserve to be sacrificed on the altar of, we did not do anything. It was going to be difficult to enforce. Thank you, Chairman Anderson, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to attempt to answer them.
Okay, one moment, please. Any questions from the committee? Councilman Brown?
Not a question for Rich. I'm just wondering, I see Keith here from the City Attorney's Office. Have we looked at examples from other municipalities to see how they're handling the language of it? I think, I don't want to speak for the entire committee, but I think in concept we're supportive of it, but it would come down to just seeing what language would pass muster, so to speak.
Rich, if you could, just for a moment, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
How this works. So.
We haven't specifically looked, I mean, with the design purpose of doing this yet. We haven't been asked to do that, but there are a number of examples out there, and they run the spectrum of language out there. Some are more watered down, some are more restrictive, and so there are plenty of examples out there, and pitfalls with all of them, I would imagine.
Councilperson,
if I might, Councilman Brown, I would just add that as a source, the U.S. Department of Transportation has a website that deals with distracted driving. It's called www.compliance.gov/, and they have sample laws for regulating this kind of activity.
Okay. Councilperson Urfenbach, if you have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my first question is, say that website again, because I'm trying to write it down.
www.compliance.gov.
Okay, then, so my question then followed Councilor Brown's is, does your group have proposed wording for any of this proposed ordinance yet? Just sort of those general ideas is where we're starting.
We believe that the ordinance as proposed, we have attempted to keep it simple to deal with the issue. The first is to prohibit texting while driving. That's both receiving and sending. We don't know what else to say in that regard. In terms of penalties or fines or anything like that, we think that is overstepping our reach as citizens. Just personally, I have no idea what the fine is for speeding in a school zone, because thank God I've not been picked up for doing that or have been doing that. But yeah, maybe that's an appropriate comparison. If you're picked up for using your handheld electronic device in a school zone, maybe it should be consistent with that. But that's really an area that the council and the city attorney's office and law enforcement are far better equipped to deal with.
Great, thank you. And Mr. Chair, if I might, I'd like to just thank Mr. Lauer as well. I appreciate the work you've put into this and the folks that you've brought with you. I do appreciate your work in getting this started.
Thank you.
Councilperson Aguilar.
Mr. Lauer, do you have examples of other communities or municipalities that put this legislation in practice before a state came forward with it?
Texas is the very best example. I believe there are 19 communities in the state of Texas. Ohio also has, well, let me return to Texas for a moment. San Antonio, Austin, the state capital, El Paso, Galveston. There are several in Texas. Offhand, I know of 2 in Ohio, Columbus and Toledo. There are, let's see, I'll share an experience, and I apologize for using my family as an example, but our younger daughter and our 2 oldest grandchildren live in Westchester, outside of Philadelphia. And so I told her, gee, your dad's involved in this, and Suzanne, maybe you want to, go to the Argus and see what your father's up to back home. And so she did, and she emailed back and said that Philadelphia had a ban on texting while driving. And it was, I think, within the last month or 6 weeks that the governor of Pennsylvania signed a statewide ban. So Pennsylvania is an example of a state that did something after cities had done it. Now, I'll just give you a little insight. My grandson, our oldest grandson's a senior at Temple University in Philadelphia. And he has some activities that he had to go to in New Jersey, an internship or something. Well, he last week was picked up for using his cell phone while driving in the state of New Jersey, paid a $111 fine. It wasn't against the law in Pennsylvania, but he should have been, he's a bright young man, he should have known what the law was. It's a little bit like South Dakota. I mean, most folks around here don't realize if you drive to the Guthrie Theater or a Twins game, that you cannot be texting in the state of Minnesota. In fact, you can't text in any of those states that surround us. So public awareness is part of the issue, and in that regard, I should share with you the fact that Tom Simmons at Mid-Continent Communication, which is one of the groups endorsing this, has offered, he said, if the City Commission passes this ordinance, he said, our production department will be happy to, free of charge, provide the production of the public service announcements. And he said, I will guarantee you personally that the South Dakota broadcasters, that's radio and TV, and the South Dakota cable broadcasters will be sure that this information is disseminated. So that's an offer in terms of the community effort from Mid-Continent. Mr. Eide, who's a part of this group, also has a advertising business and has made an offer to help in that kind of production. So And Mark Benedetto at the University of Sioux Falls, when I met with him, he offered their group. So there are a lot of folks that'd be happy to, get the rest of us informed if this goes through.
Thank you.
Councilman Brown.
Just to follow up to that statement, not a question, and Rich and I visited about this as well. I don't know that we have Pennsylvania-type politics here. I can almost assure you, and it's important that this coalition stick together, because I can almost assure you that our legislature will see this as an opportunity to take away local control. And I would bet money that come January, if this goes through, there will be a legislator who will sponsor a bill to prevent Sioux Falls from doing this. So please stick together and speak loudly across the state, because that's what it will take.
Councilperson Urfenbach.
Councilor Brown, would you go on with that story just a little bit farther and use a specific example, please?
Sure. The police chief can give details of it, but with the cameras next to the Argus leader controlling the traffic at that intersection, there was a legislator from Huron who 2 years in a row introduced legislation to prevent Sioux Falls as a city from controlling that intersection how we saw best in our local community. And I can guarantee you there will be that legislator or another one who will do the same when it comes to texting and driving.
May I comment, please?
If I may, just once before, but both Rich and I talked about, that's not a reason not to do this. It's just, I want you to be prepared to go to peer and advocate not only for this, but also for local control.
I'm not sure what the support was for cameras that zapped you if you were violating the rules out here at this intersection, but I suspect it was not close to 80%, which is the statewide approval of a ban on texting, or the 90% which exists in this community. And hopefully that widespread public support would give pause to those that might have been willing to say, you can't snap me with your camera, but when their friends and neighbors are in favor of banning texting, they may be reluctant to do that. And anyway, as you and I have discussed, that's not a reason, and if there's another tragedy, none of us would be willing to go to that family and say, we didn't do anything because we were worried that the folks in Pierre would hold us hostage. That's
Any other questions from the committee at this time?
I would just make a comment, Mr. Chair. Councilor Aguilar has already begun the research on the wording for a potential ordinance. Bless your little heart. And Councilor Aguilar and I would spearhead this to bring it back to committee in the next couple of months or so. We'll work with our new legislative operations manager, Jim David, and with the city attorney's office, and we'll start to make this move and bring it back to committee with your permission, Mr. Chair.
Well, I think we've been working long enough together to say that's pretty much what I had written down here, is that I thought this would be a good job for Jim to dig into and do some research for us also. Sue, thank you for getting that started also.
Got stuff over here?
I do have a couple questions, though, for our police department.
okay. Thank you very much.
Chief Bartell, if you or one of your staff could come up and update us on some of the challenges for the police department, and also I believe one of your members is on a state panel looking at texting and driving.
That's correct. Doug Barthel, Police Chief, thank you. First off, I want to start out by saying that I am not an advocate for texting while driving. Matter of fact, couldn't be any further from the truth. But I do certainly see some challenges with this proposal. I've met with Mr. Lauer. I applaud him and the others as a part of that group for their work on this. Frankly, it would be refreshing to see more folks that come forward on all sorts of issues. So I certainly thank them for their work on it, and anything we can do to make the roads safer, I certainly support. On the other hand, having some legislation or an ordinance in place just because we think that's the right thing to do socially, or and it's something that we can't enforce, or we have challenges getting it through court, I'm not so sure that's the best way to go. Personally, I would rather see, when it comes to traffic laws and traffic enforcement, I would rather see that be legislated at the state level. You'd be hard-pressed to count on one hand the number of city ordinances that deal with traffic enforcement that aren't mirrored in state law with some other sort of reference to a state law. The legislature, as you know, has wrestled with this topic for the last couple of years. They, not this past session, but the prior one, created a safe driving task force made up of representatives from around the state. Captain Steve Haney on our department, who's here tonight, represents our department and is also part of that task force. Texting is one of many issues that they're looking at. And I know Mr. Lauer does not like task forces. It's a great place to put something. It'll never go anywhere. But on the other hand, we've never had a task force that has looked at this issue. It's only been addressed through the legislature. I personally would like to see their work conclude and see what they come up with for solutions and suggestions. The other piece that you're also missing when you do this at the local level is when laws are proposed at the state level, there's a judicial review process where the judges and so forth can weigh in, give their concerns, and offer advice or ways that can make the law work better. You don't have that at the local level, and frankly, I think you'd be hard-pressed to get a judge that'll come in here and say, here's how you should write this ordinance. So I know we all see people with phones in their hands. Are they dialing a number? Are they looking at the internet? Are they speaking on it using the speaker phone and just holding it up? To just stop a car because somebody has a phone in their hand, and it's going to take an admission from that driver before we're able to enforce it. And I don't think we want to get in the business, start seizing phones and then looking through that or subpoenaing records. So there's a lot of challenges that lie ahead, and I know that you're obviously not passing an ordinance tonight, but again, as I started out, I don't support texting and driving, but we definitely are going to have to look at a lot of these, and I think what you're probably going to find is to truly make this something that's enforceable and is something that has a remote chance of working. And voluntary compliance is great, but if we did that for every law, I think it wouldn't take long for the word to get out. But I think to truly get this to a point where you're going to be able to overcome a lot of those obstacles is you're going to have to totally ban electronic devices in a car. So that opens up a lot of different options, and so there's just things to consider. You've got cars now with a lot of these things are built right into them, with the phone and with the navigation system with the screen, and where you're looking down at the screen as you're traveling in a unfamiliar area. So just a lot of things to consider, but again, I'm not going to be the one that's championing the cause against this ordinance, but on the other hand, I'm not so sure this is the perfect way to do it. But if you'd like, we could have Steve Haney come up and give you a little update on where they're at with the task force.
Would like that, yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Chief.
Good afternoon. Steve Haney, I'm a captain with Sioux Falls Police Department. I'm also a member on the Teen Safe Driving Task Force. I'd like to acknowledge, though, the co-chair, Dr. Randall, who is in the audience today. The task force was created last year on House Bill 1221. And we were given instructions basically to how are we to improve teen driving. One of the things that we looked at initially was that teen drivers represent 9% of all drivers in the state of South Dakota, but 20% of the fatality and injury accidents are created by teen drivers. So they're overrepresented in a lot of areas involving property damage, injury, and death related to driving in the state of South Dakota. Our teens drive at an early age here in South Dakota, at the age of 14. And within 6 months, they could have a restricted driver's license, which will allow them to drive from the hours of 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. So there's a lot of things that we looked at. We've had three meetings since the task force was created. There's 14 members on the task force and a wide variety of views and people that are assigned to it. Their parents, there's people from public safety, health industry. There's state representatives, there's state senators. Most of our information is, we receive most of the data from Department of Public Safety, the Department of Public Transportation and Health. We looked at also driver's education in the state of South Dakota. And we found out that there is not a standardized form of driver education throughout the state of South Dakota. So that was one of the focus points of it, also the distracted driving. We believe that distracted driving is underreported in the state of South Dakota because there is no checkbox on our state form that will allow us to put in there that the reason for the distracted driving. Either they were talking or visiting with a friend or texting while driving. So the state form would have to be changed too in order to get accurate data on texting while driving. But the amount of injuries or fatalities involved with teen drivers is 7% while distracted while driving. The other things we looked at are alcohol and underage drinking, rural driving versus urban driving, and also the current laws on the graduated driver's license structure that we have here right now. Like I said before, we've had 3 meetings. Our task force is to focus on teen drivers. So some of the things that we looked at were what was the highest percentage of accidents or involving teens, and we found that failure to yield is 18%. Speeding is another 18%. Following too closely is ranked at 8%, and distracted is listed at 7% of all accidents involving teen drivers. During the 3 meetings that we've had so far, we narrowed our focus, and we're looking at a couple of different proposals right now. And one is to change the format of the graduated driver's license in the state. Also, another one is to look at how many passengers should be allowed in the vehicle with a teen driver or restricted driver, and also the restrictions on using electronic devices within the vehicle while under the restricted driver's permit. So these things, our next meeting will be in June 24th, and there are 2 proposals that are out there right now that we'll fine-tune and work on, and there's other things I'm sure that we'll have to address. Because like I stated earlier, our teen drivers are overrepresented, highly represented in our fatality and injury accidents in the state of South Dakota. So, any questions?
Questions from the committee? Okay, I have a question. Does the committee have any type of timeline on when they think they'll come out with any suggestions or?
The initial timeline that was presented, we would have to have our proposals ready from committee by August, September for the next session, for 2013 session.
Okay. Any other questions from the committee?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haney. Do we have any public input at this time? Anyone else that would like to come up and have a few words? Discussion with the committee. Do we want to, well, I think, I guess I'll start it. I guess I would like to see this stay in the committee. I think that Sue has started one function that we could work with Mr. David and our legal team with the administration to see what we could come up with and then bring that back and continue the discussion.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I think that's exactly right, and I guess I'm just kind of trying to process some of the things we've heard. You know, Sioux Falls struggles on a regular basis to get things to work through the state legislature. You know, South Dakota and Sioux Falls, a lot of times are politically pretty different, and I think we need to take that into consideration, and I think we're at a point where in this topic in particular, it's time for us to take a leadership role. You know, it's about more than just teen driving, it's about all of us driving, and Councilor Aguilar gives me a bad time all the time about the little bit of texting that I do when I'm driving, and I now have the picture of Mr. Lauer in my head when I think I'm going to text. I don't. But I think we're at that point where, you know what, Sioux Falls is going to make a statement. Why not? Let's, you know, other folks have done it. Let's give it a shot.
Councilman Brown?
Councilor Erpenbach, I would encourage you to also to bring it forth at South Dakota Municipal League and the policy discussions that will happen in August. And that will be a good place to judge how other communities, maybe even more rural communities than Sioux Falls, are feeling about it. As you well know, the Municipal League would, getting behind that would be an awesome effort in moving it forward in the legislature as well.
That's a good idea.
One of the parts of our investigation that we can do is a couple of years ago, Aberdeen took a look at banning texting and driving also. It did not go through the city council. I think they were also waiting for the state at that time to come up with some legislation. But I still think that, you know, working with Mr. Haney, making sure that we're updated on what that committee is doing, working with the city attorney and our leadership here, I think that's a good start of coming up with some type of wording that could be brought back in front of this committee to see how it fits for Sioux Falls. And also that'll give the public time to reply back to what they've heard from this meeting. Once again, I will give the public, is there anyone else who would like to make a comment? Mr. Eide?
Thanks, folks. Just since I'm here, I'm Bruce Eide with Bern Eide Motor Cars. And one of the reasons that I got involved with this is because I believe in the value that this would bring to the community. And I'm also kind of representing a young lady who was my daughter's best friend, and my daughter's 27 now. Her little gal pal, Carrie, lived in Worthington, and 8 years ago this month, she didn't see the grain truck while she was texting. So we don't have any more Carrie. And so I'm kind of here on behalf of Carrie as well.
Thank you, Mr. Eide. One last thing, I'm going to reveal a secret. I tape some daytime TV shows. And one of them that I taped yesterday actually had this issue as their main topic. It's called The Doctors. And they talked about texting and driving, showed some examples that were really eye-opening, how this is really a national issue. It's just not a South Dakota or a Sioux Falls issue. This is a problem nationwide, and it definitely needs to be addressed with the number of injuries and deaths that have happened over the last couple of years. So I hope that at our next committee meeting that we can continue this discussion, and the public is once again welcome to come and add further information or anything you think is pertinent to help us. Please contact us and let us know. And Mr. David, I think we've got a real good project for you to start on. Thank you. With that, if there's no other comments, I need a motion to adjourn. Nope. Okay. Then at 5:40, the meeting of Public Services is adjourned.